Welcome to the Jesus Talks as we continue to look at the events surrounding the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. Well, when the women told all the other followers of Jesus that the mission was accomplished, that the angelic beings are given the first report from the newly discovered country of immortality, they found it hard to believe, all the other followers of Jesus. Maybe they thought it too good to be true. Maybe they just imagined people's emotions were getting carried away with them in all the trauma and fear of that time. But John takes up the story, briefly recapping the initial investigation of those women, but moving on to what happened next, which involves him and Peter. So it's from John chapter 20 from verse 1. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They've taken the Lord out of the tomb and we don't know where they've put him." So Peter and the other disciples started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over, looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but didn't go in. Then Simon Peter, who was behind him, arrived and went into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the burial cloth that had been around Jesus' head. The cloth was folded up by itself, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple, who'd reached the tomb first, also went inside. He saw and believed. They still didn't understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to their homes, but Mary stood outside the tomb, crying. Although the general response to the initial report was fairly skeptical, Peter and John must have still been holding on to the hope somewhere in their hearts and minds. Even if they didn't really believe that Jesus had gone into immortal physical life, they had to see for themselves. The fact that they were running, and there does seem to have been a certain degree of competition between Peter and John at this point, and John's quite keen for us to know that he won that race. But the fact that they were running shows how charged they were. John was cautious and didn't actually go into the tomb, but Peter pushed through and went in for a better look. The burial cloths were lying there, neatly folded up. Some have speculated that Jesus' new body just passed through the cloths as if it were either ghostly, as if he had a sort of ghostly resurrected body, and that seems unlikely. That's not really a physical resurrection if he has a ghostly body. So some have speculated that, yeah, the burial cloths are there because he sort of they just passed through his body. Or others have wondered if his body was on a sort of another level of reality, so that the not a ghostly level, but even a more substantial level of reality, and the bandages just don't relate to that level of reality. Maybe it's all a little bit too speculative, that sort of thing, because if we take the words in their natural sense, it seems much more likely that Jesus, possibly with the help of the angels, unwrapped the cloths on his body and folded them up in the tomb in just quite an ordinary way. Well, when Peter had seen these cloths and seen what was happening, John also came in to see for himself, and they now believed that Jesus really had risen from the dead. But they didn't understand all that this meant for the human race and the history of the universe, and they had not yet understood everything that the scriptures had to say about this. So in that initial moment, they kind of believed the facts before them, but that big scriptural context for what had happened, they hadn't got that. This is important because the ancient prophets had written about this event in all kinds of ways for many hundreds of years. The living God set out how the Messiah would be resurrected in detailed predictions long before this happened, so that when it all actually did happen, it would be possible to understand it all and appreciate what the living God was doing. So Jesus didn't just rise from the dead in an intellectual vacuum. There were thousands of years of preparation for this, and the ancient prophets knew exactly what the meaning of this event would be and preached about it. And in the ancient law, there were rituals and offerings and events and festivals, all designed to give the context, the understanding, the meaning, the significance of this resurrection event. So Mary Magdalene, she had not gone into the tomb, but still convinced that Jesus' body had simply been stolen, she waited outside in tears. So let's take up that part of the story. John 20 from verse 11. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw 2 angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head, the other at the foot. They asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They've taken away my Lord," she said. "I don't know where they've put him." At this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there. But she didn't realize it was Jesus. "Woman," he said, "why are you crying? Who is it you're looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you've put him, and I'll get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned toward him and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said, "Don't hold on to me, for I've not yet returned to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am returning to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, "I've seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her. So by the time Mary was ready to look into the tomb, Peter and John had gone home, and she saw 2 angels sitting in the tomb. Perhaps the angels had been there all the time, but neither Peter nor John had been given the ability to see them. For the angels, this was a time of great joy and excitement, so they found Mary's tears difficult to understand. Before Mary got into a conversation with them, Jesus himself came to the tomb and he asked her what was making her so sad. That ability to see angels just for interest's sake, in 2 Kings 6 verse 17 from the Old Testament, there's another example of a man who doesn't normally see angels, but is suddenly given the ability to see them. And whether maybe Mary always could see angels, because she just seemed to be a woman of great theological and spiritual understanding. So maybe she could always see angels, but Peter and John didn't seem to always be able to see them. Now, it must have been strange for Jesus in those first few hours. He'd passed into an immortal form of human life, beyond all reach of death or decay. He must have felt such a joy at having gone through his terrible ordeal, and now he would never need to face any pain or sorrow ever again. And it's hard to imagine just what that must feel like to live, to have a human body that is freed from the bondage of decay comprehensively, fundamentally. That if the human body was primally designed to live forever, to have such a body, to feel it pulsing with life and energy, vitality, that's what it must have felt like. Nevertheless, Jesus was still, for a few weeks in fact, part of the ordinary life of this old passing age, this present time of death and darkness. He is the man of the future, the end of the universe, walking around right in the middle of history. However, Jesus did all this out of love for us. That's always been his message throughout his teaching. He didn't do this for himself, because he already enjoyed a glorious eternal existence before the world began. He had known for infinite ages what it was like to be filled with life without measure. This isn't the first time he'd experienced that kind of overflowing life. So as he experiences it, it's not for him a personal achievement. It's always only ever been done for the benefit of others. So even in that resurrection joy, Jesus has real compassion for Mary Magdalene. He's thinking about her. Through her tearful eyes, she thinks Jesus is simply the gardener, and that may well be a reference back to the original story of Genesis in a way, but that's a thought for another time. And she starts to blurt out all her fears and worries, and then Jesus simply speaks her name. Mary knows him right away, and she wants to cling on to him, never to let him go again. She thought everything was falling apart, but now it seems it'll all go back to normal, that it'll all go on as it did before. Things can be back as they were last week. And Jesus has to gently break her grip and her expectations. Things aren't just going back to normal. Nothing will ever be the same again. There is a new and final chapter of this present age of the world about to begin. Jesus was not going to hang around as he had for the past 3 years. The days of walking around Judea, of teaching and healing, they'd come to an end. Jesus had other work to do now, work that would take him to the very control room of the universe. For now, Jesus would meet with his followers in a whole variety of special meetings, taking them through the ancient scriptures, showing them all that had been written about him. He had to get them ready to take this world-changing news out to the whole world. Paul of Tarsus, when he was writing to the Jesus movement that was forming in the Greek city of Corinth, maybe 20 years later, reminded them of all the people that saw Jesus during this time of resurrection. He writes in 1 Corinthians 15 from verse 3, "What I received I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also. When the Corinthians were wondering whether they needed to believe in something as amazing or unbelievable as the physical resurrection of Jesus, Paul reminds them that this is not a religious theory, but a historical fact witnessed by many people. On one occasion, Jesus came to a gathering of his followers with more than 500 men in attendance. If we assume the same number of women and children in addition, the immortal Jesus may have spoken to more than 1,500 people on one occasion. Paul invites the Corinthians to follow up on this and go to talk to the people who were present if they were still in any doubt.